Test 1, 2. Dette er en lydtest for foredraget som starter klokka 19 med Antony Beevor. Dette er en lydtest for foredraget som starter om cirka 3 kvarter klokka 19. Og vi kjører en lydtest. Test 1, 2. Da tester vi med litt høyere nivå. Lydnivået skal øke litt nå på lydtest for foredraget med Antony Beevor.
Ladies and gentlemen, sorry about the delay, but we wanted to fill up this hall before we started. Welcome. Welcome to you here in Wergelandshallen, and welcome to you following the streaming in the room upstairs, and welcome to you all following the streaming from everywhere. And welcome, Sir Antony Beevor. It's a great honor to have you here, flying in, having a very busy time in Norway, and being here with us. My name is Guri Hjeltnes. I'm a director of the Norwegian Center for Holocaust and Minority Studies. And this series of lectures, Dypdykk i annen verdenskrig, examining the Second World War in depth, I held in cooperation with the University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway, with my colleague and co-host tonight, Professor Tom Christiansen. We started out these lectures on war, occupation, Holocaust, and settlements in the fall of 2019, managed a few lectures in the winter of 2020, and then we locked down, as everyone else, due to the pandemic. And a warm thanks to Ekpo's legat, financing these series of lectures. And I'm quite sure all these programs this fall is absolutely full. We will continue in 2023. Starting again this fall, we experienced an enormous interest from the public. This lecture tonight was fully booked weeks ago, and this afternoon we realized that every lecture this fall are full. But however, as you've seen now, the experience is that people book tickets but do not show up. So there might be openings, there have been openings tonight, and there will be this fall. But anyway, the topic of tonight. This October and November, Norway will commemorate the deportation of Jews from Norway 80 years ago. In 2 days, October 26, it is 80 years since the Jewish men were arrested. In a month, it is 80 years since the arrest and deportation and transport on 2 ships of the Jews from Norway on November 26th. The arrest and deportation took place over 3 years between 1941 and the winter of 1943. And this fall we see several books on different aspects of the Holocaust are published in Norway. The interest and research on the fate of the Jews and Holocaust is really growing. There will be this fall commemorating the 80 years, several book launches, there will be concerts, there will be commemoration ceremonies, talks in many venues this fall. And therefore, we do appreciate that the speaker of tonight, Sir Antony Beevor, coming to Norway, he's actually launching a book on the Russian Revolution and Civil War. Tonight, he really wanted to talk on the turning point of the Holocaust. But I will say that Sir Antony, after the lecture and after the questions, he will sign his new book outside. So, who is this gentleman? Sir Antony is a result of the Second World War, the liberation, born in 1946. He's a military historian, published several popular historical works on the Second World War and the Spanish Civil War. Born in Kensington, Beevor was educated at 2 independent schools, Aberley Hall School in Worcestershire, followed by the Winchester College in Hampshire. Then he went to the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, where he studied under the military historian John Keegan, before he received a commission in the 11th Hussars in 1967. And Beevor served in England and Germany and was promoted to lieutenant in 1969 before resigning his commission in 1970. And since this, he has been writing books. Sir Antony's books include Crete, The Battle and Resistance, Paris After the Liberation, written with his wife Artemis Cooper, Stalingrad 1998, Berlin, The Downfall 1945. His books on the Spanish Civil War from 1982 was later rewritten and published in 2006 at the Battle for Spain, the Spanish Civil War 1936-1939. Then, D-Day, the Battle for Normandy, amongst many others. And not at least the huge, it's 10 bricks. The Second World War, 2012. That's a must for everyone in the field, notable for its focus on the conditions and grief faced by women and civilians, and also for its coverage of the war in East Asia. And, needless to say, Sir Antony has been in Norway before, because in Norway his books in Norwegian sell quite well. So, after this lecture, there will be questions and comments from you, the audience. We have not planned a long comment because we know the interest for listening to Sir Antony is so big, so it's all an opportunity for you to actually ask him questions and come with comments. We'll be back to that. But while we're waiting for that, it's an honor to invite Sir Antony up here. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Great, thank you very much indeed. The history of the Holocaust, or Shoah, has never been straightforward. Even leaving aside the noxious attempts of deniers to muddy the waters, there have been some intense debates about key decisions in the development of the Holocaust. The basic problem, of course, is the lack of key documents. Perhaps, not surprisingly, Hitler wanted nothing written down, and the SS destroyed as many files as possible before the war ended. For many years, there was a split between groups of historians and their interpretations. One was called intentionalist and the other was called functionalist. The intentionalists argued that the Holocaust was entirely directed from Hitler and Himmler in Berlin. The functionalists, on the other hand, argued that the chaotic competition of Nazi bureaucracy and local initiatives, in fact, played a prominent part. Since then, a more nuanced compromise between the two positions has evolved. Comprehension on the subject was also not improved by a trend in the United States making the Holocaust a sacred subject of its own. This bizarre and misleading approach removed the subject from its context of the Second World War. I was greatly encouraged, therefore, when in 2012 I was invited by the Holocaust Remembrance Center of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem to give the opening keynote in the 4-day major conference, which posed the question, 1942, a turning point in World War II and in the comprehension of the final solution. Not only does this question firmly place the subject of the Holocaust back within the Second World War, where it clearly belongs, but it also seeks to tackle the key factors which accelerated what Vasily Grossman termed the Shoah by bullet into the Shoah by gas. This also means examining the intentionalist-functionalist issue from a rather different aspect. While accepting that the Holocaust developed in an almost haphazard way, did the step change in 1942 also come from above? Because Hitler and Himmler became secretly conscious of the possibility that they might not win the war after all. This might well have made them determined to accelerate a final solution so that even if the Third Reich faced its own Gotterdammerung, no Jews would survive them. The whole process of Nazi persecution, which ran from the anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws of 1935 through to the industrialized murder of the death camps, starting in 1942, was uneven to say the least. So let's look back over the key stages. Up until the European War in September 1939, the Nazis had hoped to force German and Austrian Jews to emigrate through maltreatment, humiliation, and the expropriation of their property. But as soon as hostilities started, immigration became virtually impossible. And then that autumn, the Nazis' conquest of Poland brought a further 1.7 million Jews under their jurisdiction. In May 1940, during the invasion of France, Himmler wrote a paper for Hitler entitled "Some Thoughts on the Treatment of Alien Populations in the East." He suggested screening the Polish population so that the racially valuable could be Germanized, while the rest were turned into slave labor. As for the Jews, he wrote, "I hope completely to erase the concept of Jews through the possibility of a great emigration to a colony in Africa or elsewhere." We tend to forget that at that stage, Himmler considered genocide, which he called the Bolshevik method of physical extermination, to be un-German and impossible. Himmler's idea of shipping European Jews abroad focused on the French island of Madagascar. Adolf Eichmann, still a junior functionary at that time, was meanwhile thinking of Palestine, a British mandate. But for that, Britain needed to be defeated first. Himmler's deputy, Reinhard Heydrich, also argued that the problem of, by then, 3.75 million Jews on German-occupied territory could only be solved through a territorial solution. The problem was that even though they might be able, after the defeat of France in the summer of 1940, to force Vichy France to accept the Madagascar project, transporting Jews there could not work in the face of British naval superiority. Nevertheless, the idea of deporting Jews to starve in a reservation somewhere still remained the preferred option at that stage. In March 1941, with the ghettos in Poland overflowing, mass sterilization was considered. Then, as Hitler's plans for Operation Barbarossa were confirmed, senior Nazis adopted or embraced a new idea. And this was to remove all of Europe's Jews, as well as 31 million Slavs, to some area deep in the Soviet Union, to starve to death there once victory was achieved. This, they thought, could be accomplished when German armies advanced to what was designated the Archangel-Astrakhan line. Any remnants of the Red Army would retreat to the Urals, where they could be contained by the Luftwaffe. But Hitler, in his invasion of the Soviet Union, had completely failed to learn the lessons from the Sino-Japanese War. Japanese generals in 1937 had committed a grave error in grossly underestimating the outrage among the Chinese population and their consequent determination to resist. Conspicuous cruelty did not shock the Chinese into submission, as they had expected. The possibility had simply not occurred to the Imperial General Staff in Tokyo that China's answering strategy to Japanese aggression would be to wage a drawn-out war of attrition. The Japanese assumption that their well-trained modern army could rapidly destroy much larger but badly armed and ill-coordinated forces failed to take into account the huge landmass into which the Chinese nationalist armies could withdraw. The similarities with Hitler's onslaught on the Soviet Union were striking. Yet astonishingly, Hitler and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht never seemed to have drawn any lessons from the war in China, despite the fact that Chiang Kai-shek had been advised by General von Falkenhausen. I think that it is generally accepted now that the geopolitical turning point of the Second World War came in early December 1941. This was when the Wehrmacht was halted outside Moscow and Hitler declared war on the United States of America following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But for the Allies, the situation didn't look any more encouraging at the time. December 1941 and the first months of 1942 were some of the most dangerous in the whole conflict for the Allies and all those suffering under Nazi oppression. Many believed that the Nazis would never be defeated. In Brazil, the world-famous Jewish writer Stefan Zweig committed suicide with his wife for that very reason. And 6 months later, as the Wehrmacht attacked towards the Caucasus and Stalingrad, the German Jewish professor Victor Klemperer wrote in his diary, "The external situation is darker than ever." For Churchill, the year of 1942 may have opened encouragingly. In the course of an extended visit to Washington, he had concluded some important agreements with President Roosevelt. The policy of defeating Germany first had been reconfirmed, despite the evident opposition of the US Navy, which wanted to concentrate on the Pacific theatre. But almost as soon as Churchill was back in Britain, his good mood vanished. On the night of the 11th of February, and during the following day, the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau made their channel dash from Brest back to German waters. In the bad visibility, neither the RAF nor Royal Navy motor torpedo boats managed to inflict any direct hits. It was seen as a national humiliation. Far worse was to follow. On the 15th of February, General Percival in Singapore surrendered. The shock of losing the great British bastion in the Far East was enormous. It seemed as if the British could not get anything right. Churchill found himself facing a mood close to defeatism. His own popularity dropped so low that he thought he was about to be ousted from office. And at the same time, anti-British feeling increased significantly in the United States. Also that month, the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm added a fourth rotor to their Enigma machines. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park called the new system Shark and struggled for months without success to break it. To make matters worse, the Germans had cracked the Admiralty code known as Naval Cipher 3, which exchanged convoy details with the Americans. Shark was not broken until December. So in the course of 1942, German U-boats sank 1,769 Allied and 90 neutral ships. Churchill later said that the Battle of the Atlantic was, without doubt, his greatest worry in the whole war. The war in North Africa had also taken a turn for the worse. Rommel's Africa Corps had been reinforced, and the British Eighth Army was driven all the way back into Egypt. Many feared that we would lose the whole of the Middle East and our oil supplies. In the Soviet Union, German armies charged forward in southern Russia, heading for the Caucasus and Stalingrad. The sorely battered Red Army appeared incapable of halting the Wehrmacht. In the Nazi-occupied territories, the murder of Jews continued apace. Goebbels had noted in his diary on the 14th of February that the Führer once more expressed his determination to clean up the Jews in Europe pitilessly. Their destruction will go hand in hand with the destruction of our enemies. This was not just a figure of speech. Right from the start of the Nazi invasion in June 1941, the mass murder of Jews had been made an integral part of the war effort on the Eastern Front. In fact, just over 2 weeks before the invasion of the Soviet Union, the OKW, the German High Command, had secretly issued the notorious Kommissarbefehl in flagrant defiance of international law. Ostensibly, this order called for the immediate execution of Soviet commissars. But by using the term Judeo-Bolshevik, Jews were implicitly included as dangerous to Bolsheviks to be dealt with in the same way. Soldiers, it stated, should not be prosecuted for crimes, German soldiers, it stated, should not be prosecuted for crimes against civilians unless the needs of discipline absolutely required it. We've seen a recent similar order coming from Prigozhin towards his prisoners who are being recruited to fight in Ukraine, which is rather striking. For Hans Frank, the regent of the General Government in Poland, the invasion of the Soviet Union offered the opportunity to get rid of all the Jews who'd been dumped on his territory. Others, including Heydrich, concentrated on more immediate concerns, particularly the pacification of the conquered territories in the East. Hitler's notion of pacification was quite clear. This will happen best, he told Alfred Rosenberg, the Minister of the Eastern Territories, by shooting dead anyone who even looks sideways at us. Army commanders, now in Hitler's thrall after the triumph over France, which they had openly doubted, failed to raise any objections. Some of them embraced with enthusiasm the idea of the war of annihilation, of Vernichtungskrieg. Any outrage about the murderous actions of the SS in Poland had faded. Generalfeldmarschall von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief, worked closely with Heydrich on liaison between the army and the SS during Barbarossa. The German army would provision the Einsatzgruppen and would liaise with them through the senior intelligence officer in each army headquarters. The Shoah by bullets is usually remembered by the activities of the 3,000 men in the SS Einsatzgruppen. As a result, the massacres carried out by the 11,000 men in 21 battalions of Ordnungspolizei, acting as a second wave to the rear of the advancing armies, have tended to be rather overlooked. Himmler also assembled an SS cavalry brigade and 2 other Waffen-SS brigades to be ready to assist. The commander of the 1st SS Cavalry Regiment was Hermann Fegelein, who in 1944 married Eva Braun's sister and thus became part of the Führer's entourage. Himmler ordered his SS cavalry to execute all male Jews and drive their women into the swamps of the Pripyat marshes. By mid-August 1941, the cavalry brigade claimed to have killed 200 Russians in combat and to have shot 13,788 civilians, most, of course, of whom were Jews described as plunderers or looters. Each of the 3 army groups in the invasion was to be closely followed by an Einsatzgruppe. A 4th will be added later down in the south on the Black Sea coast, following the Romanians and the German 11th Army. The Einsatzgruppen personnel were recruited from all sections of Himmler's empire, including the Waffen-SS, the Sicherheitsdienst, the Sicherheitspolizei, the SIPO, the Kriminalpolizei Kripo, and the Ordnungspolizei. Each Einsatzgruppe of around 800 men would consist of 2 Sonderkommandos operating closely behind the troops and 2 Einsatzkommandos a little further back. Heydrich instructed the Einsatzgruppen commanders, who came from the intellectual elite of the SS, the majority had doctorates, to encourage local anti-Semitic groups to kill Jews and communists. These activities were described as self-cleansing efforts. But they were not to indicate official German approval, nor to allow these groups to believe that their actions might gain them any form of political independence. The Einsatzgruppen themselves were to execute Communist Party officials, commissars, partisans, and saboteurs, and Jews in party and state positions. Presumably, Heydrich had also suggested that they could and should go beyond these categories as they saw fit, when fulfilling their duties with unprecedented harshness, such as shooting all male Jews of military age. But there seems to have been no official indication at this stage of encouraging the murder of Jewish women and children. The killing of Jewish males began as soon as the German armies crossed the Soviet frontier on the 22nd of June. Many of the early massacres were carried out by Lithuanian and Ukrainian anti-Semites, as Heydrich had predicted. In western Ukraine, local anti-Semites killed some 24,000 Jews. In Kaunas, some 3,800 were slaughtered. Sometimes watched by German soldiers, Jews were rounded up and tormented, with rabbis having their beards pulled or set on fire. Then they were beaten to death by the cheers of the crowd. The Germans fostered the idea that these killings were revenge for the massacres carried out by the NKVD before it retreated. Einsatzgruppen and police battalions had also begun to round up and shoot Jews in hundreds and even thousands. Their victims had to prepare their own mass graves, and any who did not dig fast enough were shot. They were then forced to undress, partly so that their clothes could be redistributed later, but also in case they had concealed valuable items or money in them. This particular pattern was, of course, also learned from the Cheka during the Russian Civil War. It was very striking how much was copied in that particular way. Forced to kneel on the edge of the pit, they were then shot in the back of the head so that their body would roll forward and drop. Other SS and police units considered it tidier to make their first victims lie in a row along the bottom of the Great Trench and shoot them in situ with submachine guns. Then the next batch would be made to lie down on the bodies, head to toe, and they too would be shot. This was known as the sardine method. In a number of cases, Jews were driven into a synagogue which would be set on fire, and any who tried to escape would, of course, be shot down. With Himmler's constant encouragement to his men, the process became self-escalating. The original target group of Jews in party and state positions immediately expanded to include all male Jews of military age, then to all male Jews regardless of age. In late June and early July, it was mainly local anti-Semitic groups who killed Jewish women and children. But by the end of July, SS Einsatzgruppen, Hitler's Waffen-SS brigades and police battalions were regularly killing women and children too. They were assisted, despite Hitler's instruction against arming Slavs, by some 26 battalions of locally recruited police, most of whom were attracted by the chance of robbing their victims. Ordinary German soldiers and Luftwaffe personnel also took part in the killings, as interrogators from the NKVD 7th Department later found out from German prisoners, as one Soviet report stated, and I quote, "A pilot from the 3rd Air Squadron said that he participated in the execution of a group of Jews in one of the villages near Vendepunktet at the beginning of the war. They were executed as a punishment for handing over a German pilot to the Red Army. A fighter from the 765th Pioneer Battalion named Traxler witnessed executions by SS soldiers of Jews near Rovno and Dubno. When one of the soldiers remarked that it was a terrible sight, an Unteroffizier from the same unit called Graf said, 'The Jews are swine, and eliminating them is to show that you are a civilized person.' One day, a German transport fighter, accompanied by their company clerk, happened to see men, women, and children with their hands bound together with wire being driven along the road by SS personnel. They went to see what was happening. Outside the village, they saw a 150-meter trench about 3 meters deep. Hundreds of Jews had been rounded up. The victims were forced to lie in the trench in rows so that an SS man on each side could walk along shooting them with captured Soviet submachine guns. The people were again driven forward, and they had to get in and lie on top of the dead. At that moment, a young girl, she must have been about 12 years old, cried out in a clear, piteous, shrill voice, 'Let me live, I'm still only a child.' The child was grabbed, thrown into the ditch, and shot. A very few managed to slip away from these massacres. Not surprisingly, they were completely traumatized by what they had experienced. On the northeastern edge of Ukraine, Vasily Grossman encountered one of them. A girl, a Jewish beauty, who has managed to escape from the Germans, has bright, absolutely insane eyes, he wrote in his notebook. Younger officers in the Wehrmacht seem to have assented to the killing of Jewish children more readily than the older generation. because they believed that otherwise they would return to take revenge in the future. In September 1944, a conversation between General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach and his son in the Kriegsmarine was secretly recorded while they were in British captivity later in the war. In my opinion, said General Eberbach, one can even go as far as to say that the killing of those million Jews, or however many it was necessary in the interests of our people. But to kill the women and children wasn't necessary. That is going too far. His son disagreed. Well, if you're going to kill off the Jews, then kill the women and children too, or the children at least. There is no need to do it publicly, but what good does it do me to kill off the old people? In general, troops from the frontline formations participated less in the massacres, but there were notable exceptions, especially the SS Viking division in Ukraine and certain infantry divisions which took part in killings such as those in Brest-Litovsk. While there can be no doubt of the close cooperation between SS and Army Group headquarters, at the same time, senior army officers tried to distance themselves from what was happening. Orders were issued against members of the Wehrmacht taking part in or witnessing mass killings. Yet increasing numbers of off-duty soldiers turned up to watch and photograph the atrocities, as became evident many years later when a number of these photographs were published. Some even volunteered to take over when the executioners wanted a rest. As well as in Lithuania, Latvia, and Belarus, the mass killings spread across Ukraine, often assisted by locals recruited as auxiliaries. Anti-Semitism had greatly increased during the Great Ukrainian Famine because Soviet agents had started rumors suggesting that profiteering Jews were primarily responsible for the starvation. This, of course, was to deflect responsibility away from Stalin's own policies of collectivization and dekulakization. Ukrainian volunteers were also used for guarding Red Army prisoners. They're willing and comradely, a graffiti wrote. They represent a considerable relief for us. After the massacres in Lvov and other cities, Ukrainians helped by denouncing and rounding up Einsatzgruppe's victims in Berdyshev, which had one of the highest concentration of Jews. When German forces entered the city, the soldiers were shouting "Juda kaput" from their trucks and waved their arms, Vasily Grossman discovered later in the war. More than 20,000 Jews were killed in batches out by the airstrip, and they included Grossman's own mother. For the rest of his life, he was tormented by guilt that he had not brought her back to Moscow the moment the German invasion had begun. A Jewish woman called Ida Belozovskaya described the scene when the Germans entered her town near Kiev on the 19th of September 1941. People with fawning, happy, servile faces were standing along both sides of the road greeting their liberators, she wrote. On that day, I knew already that our life was coming to an end, that our ordeal was beginning. We were all in a mousetrap. Where could one go? There was nowhere to escape. Jews were not just denounced to the German authorities out of anti-Semitism, but also out of fear, as Belozovskaya testified. The Germans would kill any family found sheltering Jews. So even those who were sympathetic and prepared to give food did not dare to shelter them. Although the Hungarian army, attached to Rundstedt's Army Group South, did not take part in so many mass killings, the Romanians attacking Odessa, a city with a large Jewish population, committed appalling atrocities. Already in the summer of 1941, Romanian troops were said to have killed more than 10,000 Jews when seizing back the Soviet-occupied areas of Bessarabia and Bukovina. Even German officers regarded the conduct of their ally as chaotic and unnecessarily sadistic, especially in Odessa. Because of Hitler's avoidance of confiding controversial decisions to paper, historians have interpreted the invasive and often euphemistic language of subsidiary documents in different ways when trying to assess the exact moment at which the decision was made to launch the final solution. This has proved an impossible task, especially since the progression towards outright genocide consisted of unrecorded encouragement from the top, as well as an uncoordinated series of steps and experiments carried out on the spot by the different killing groups. In a curious way, it happened to mirror the Auftragstaktik of the army, whereby a general instruction was translated into action by the commander on the ground. Some historians argue that the basic decision took place in July or August 1941, when a quick victory still seemed to be within the Wehrmacht's grasp. Others think that it didn't take place until the autumn, when the German advance in the Soviet Union slowed perceptibly and a territorial solution looked increasingly impracticable. And some put it even later, suggesting the second week of December, when the German army was halted outside Moscow and Hitler declared war on the United States. The fact that each Einsatzgruppe interpreted its mission slightly differently suggests that there was little in the way of centrally issued instructions. But a significant event had already taken place on the 15th of August, when Himmler witnessed, for the first time, an execution of 100 Jews near Minsk, a spectacle organized at his request by Einsatzgruppe B. The Reichsführer SS, however, could not bear to look. Afterwards, Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bech-Zalewski underlined the point that on that occasion no more than 100 had been shot. "Look at the eyes of the men in this commando," Bech-Zalewski said to Himmler, "how deeply shaken they are. These men are finished for the rest of their lives. What kind of followers are we training here? Either neurotics or savages?" Bech-Zalewski himself, suffering from nightmares and stomach pains, was later taken to hospital to be treated on Himmler's orders by the head physician of the SS. Himmler made a speech afterwards to the men, congratulating them on their actions, and he indicated that Hitler had issued an order for the liquidation of all Jews in the Eastern Territories. He compared their work to the elimination of bedbugs and rats. That afternoon, he discussed alternatives to shooting with Bech-Zalewski and Arthur Neber, the Einsatzgruppe commander. Neber suggested an experiment using explosives, which Himmler approved, but this proved a crude, messy, and embarrassing failure. The next stage was the gas fan using carbon monoxide from the exhaust. Himmler wanted to find a method which was more humane for the executioners. Concerned for their spiritual welfare, he urged commanders to organize social events in the evenings with sing-songs. Most of the killers, however, preferred to seek solitary oblivion in the bottle. An intensification of the slaughter of Jews also coincided with the Wehrmacht's increasingly brutal and outright killing of Soviet prisoners of war. On the 3rd of September, the insecticide Zyklon B, developed by the chemical conglomerate of IG Farben, was used at Auschwitz-Birkenau for the first time in a test on Soviet soldiers and Polish prisoners. Meanwhile, Jews from Germany and Western Europe were being transported in such numbers to the Eastern Territories that police officials insisted that they had to kill them all on arrival, as they did not have accommodation or food for them. During that autumn and winter of 1941, senior officials in the German-occupied Eastern Territories, the Reichskommissariat Ostland, the Baltic States and part of Belarus, and the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, had no clear idea of what the official policy really was. This would only be settled at the Wannsee Conference, which was in any case delayed from early December until the following January, 1942, by those great events which constituted the geopolitical turning point of the war. On the 5th of December 1941, the Red Army launched its first great counterattack west of Moscow. 2 days later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. After another 4 days to assess the implications of these momentous developments, Hitler announced to the Reichstag on the 11th of December his declaration of war on the United States. And the following day, he summoned Nazi Party leaders to the Reichschancellery. There, he referred once again to his anti-Jewish prophecy of the 30th of January 1939, that if a world war ensued, the instigators of this bloody conflict will thus have to pay for it with their lives. The conflict had now truly become global. In Hitler's manic distortion of cause and effect, the Jews were to be made to suffer for their guilt. The Führer is determined to make a clean sweep, Goebbels wrote in his diary of the 12th of December. He prophesied to the Jews that if they were once again to cause a world war, the result would be their own destruction. That was no figure of speech. The world war is here. The destruction of Jewry must be the inevitable consequence. This question is to be viewed without sentimentality. Less than a week later, Hitler had a meeting with Himmler to discuss the Jewish question. Yet despite a heightened, even feverish atmosphere, Hitler still does not appear to have made an irrevocable decision on a final solution. Despite his apocalyptic diatribes against the Jews, he seems curiously reluctant to hear details of mass killings, rather as he turned away from any image of suffering in battle or civilians suffering from bombing. His desire to keep violence abstract was a psychological paradox in one who had done more than almost anyone else in history to promote its reality. After these delays, the infamous SS conference finally took place on the 20th of January 1942 in a large villa on the shore of the Wannsee on the southwestern edge of Berlin. SS Obergruppenführer Heydrich presided, and SS Obersturmbannführer Eichmann took notes. Just over half of all of those present had doctorates, and a significant minority were lawyers. Apart from other members of the Reich Security Head Administration, most of those present were senior representatives from the occupied territories, the Reichschancellery, and 4 chief officials from key ministries. The Foreign Ministry was represented by Unterstaatssekretär Martin Luther, the namesake of a far more famous and influential anti-Semite. He arrived with a carefully prepared memorandum entitled Requests and Ideas of the Foreign Ministry in Connection with the Intended Final Solution of the Jewish Question in Europe. Heydrich began by asserting his powers for the preparation of the final solution over all territories and official functions. He presented statistics on all Jewish communities throughout Europe, including even British Jews. His estimated total for the whole continent was 11 million. They would first be whittled down through hard labor, then the survivors would be treated accordingly. Elderly Jews and those who had fought for the Kaiser would be sent to the show camp at Theresienstadt in Bohemia. Luther, on behalf of the Foreign Ministry, urged caution and delay in the rounding up of Jews in countries such as Denmark and Norway, where this might provoke an international reaction. Time was then spent arguing over the complicated question of how to deal with those of partial Jewish descent, the so-called Mischlinge, and those married to Aryans. Perhaps predictably, the representative of the Generalgouvernement urged that the Jews should be dealt with first because they were swamped. Finally, while they drank brandy after lunch, the participants discussed various methods available of achieving their objective. But the minutes of the meeting avoided such detail. They retained the usual euphemisms such as evacuation and resettlement. One thing, however, was clear to everyone involved. All previous ideas of a territorial solution, that is to say, dumping large numbers of Jews in inhospitable places to starve to death, was now out of the question. With Stalin's unexpected general offensive following the Battle of Moscow, and thus no imminent certainty of German forces reaching the Archangel-Astrakhan line, they lacked a suitable area. The only certain solution now seemed to be industrialized slaughter. A great impatience to get on with tackling the task permeated the Nazi administration, both in Berlin and especially in Frank's fiefdom of the Generalgouvernement. And Gauleiter Arthur Greiser wanted to eliminate 35,000 Poles suffering from tuberculosis in the Warthegau. During the Shoah by bullets, the killing squads had to round up as well as kill their victims. But in this next stage, the Shoah by gas, the victims would be transported to their death and their bodies destroyed by fire, not buried. This process, which required far less manpower, began to be put into effect initially in the extermination camps of Chomno, where gas vans were used, and continued later in Belzec, Treblinka, Sobibor, and then Auschwitz-Birkenau in the summer of 1942. A formidable administrative apparatus was set up to cope with the Jews who had not yet died in the ghettos or been shot. Eichmann, who was responsible for rounding up all the Jewish populations outside Poland, worked closely with Gruppenführer Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo. Eichmann, another who loved the violin, played chess with Müller once a week while they continued to mull over their immense task. The most essential element in the whole operation was transport. Planning and timetables were of critical importance. The Reichsbahn, with 1.4 million employees, was the largest organization in Germany after the Wehrmacht, and it made a considerable profit. Jews were transported in freight cars and cattle wagons at the same price as fare-paying passengers, in the coaches on a one-way ticket. Journeys for the guards from the Ordnungspolizei were charged on the basis of return fares. The Gestapo took the money to pay for this from Jewish funds. But the ideological obsession of Hitler, Himmler, and Heydrich often proved totally at odds with the conduct of the war they were trying to win. The Wehrmacht began to complain about the elimination of skilled Jewish labor in the armaments industry and the huge diversion of rail transport when it was so badly needed to resupply the Eastern Front. Jewish community leaders were told to organize their own policing of the relocation, with the threat that if they did not do it, then the SA or the SS would do it instead. They knew what that would signify in terms of broken heads. They also had to draw up lists for the transport. Those sent to the Ostland were executed by shooting on arrival, mainly in Minsk, Kaunas, and Riga. As I was saying, because they were complaining that they had no food or facilities even to hold them. The majority, depending on their point of departure, were soon dispatched to the extermination camps. The elderly and so-called privileged Jews sent to Theresienstadt did not know that their death sentence was probably just in abeyance. The active participation of the Wehrmacht, officials in almost every ministry, a large part of industry and the whole of the transport system involved many tens of thousands of people. Far, far more profited from the despoliation of Jewish communities, houses, businesses, apartments, everything from clothes to household utensils being shared out. This spreading of the guilt to implicate as many people as possible in Nazi crimes was quite clearly a deliberate policy. And this too is significant. Absolute victors do not have to worry about facing trials for their war crimes. But now the Nazis accelerated the killing machine, having woken up to the fact that they might well have to face military failure and retribution after all. The regime did everything that it could to keep the extermination process secret. Himmler, speaking to senior SS officers in October 1943, described it as an unwritten and never to be written page of glory in our history. In stark contrast, Vasily Grossman, traumatized after researching and reconstructing the atrocities of Treblinka, wrote, it is the writer's duty to tell this terrible truth, and it is the civilian duty of the reader to learn it. Thank you very much.
We will have some chairs, so just 2 minutes to change the scenes. I think some people will help us with the chairs here.
Right, so Tom, shall I leave it to you to kick off?
Yeah, yes.
Fine.
You sit there, is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Okay, that's fine. Do you have some water? Vil du ha noe vann? Jenny, har du 2 vannglass til Tom og meg? One moment. Do you have the...
Is the mic on? Yeah. Okay. I hesitate to thank you for telling us this shattering, out-and-out shattering story. But it, as you mentioned, it needs to be told.
Yes.
Incessantly. We will open up for comments and questions from the audience, but I would like to take the opportunity to start. And there has been a debate in the UK on whether something could have been done. And the basis of that debate is that Churchill's and even Roosevelt's intelligence services knew a lot about what was happening. So it has been suggested that, for example, the RAF could interfere by way of bombing railway tracks and things like that. But that both Churchill and Roosevelt were reluctant because they were anxious not to provoke anti-Semites within their own societies. Or, no, that's not right.
I don't think, I've never heard that as the reason. No, it was entirely their air commanders who were opposed.
Yeah.
But let's take it in and think. One's got to remember the intelligence on exactly what was happening in the extermination camps was pretty well clear by November 1942. So even before the Battle for Moscow, what am I talking about? By November 1942, nothing to do with the Battle for Moscow. Sorry, I'm getting confused. The intergovernmental declaration was made in December, basically warning the Germans that they would be held responsible for their crimes. Churchill did ask the RAF, what can you do? But already the RAF knew by then that, for example, in their attacks on bridges, the heavy bombers were useless in terms of accuracy. They were quite often, in terms of area bombing of German cities, they were allowing for a 5-kilometer variation in terms of, in fact, sometimes even much bigger, sometimes 10 kilometers variation of where the bombs were actually dropping. So from the point of view of the railways, the heavy bombers, which had the range and could have reached Auschwitz, simply were not accurate enough. The other thing was that the Germans by then were brilliant, I'm afraid, at the way that they had along all of their main railway lines, they had spare rails, and they could actually get the railway up and running within 24 hours of an air attack, even assuming it had been accurate. On the other hand, Churchill was also facing Arthur Harris, the commander-in-chief of Bomber Command, who was a bloody-minded man who was thoroughly disliked by a lot of people. But he was a hero to the British because of his determination to smash German cities, acre by acre, hectare by hectare. And so it was impossible to sack Harris. And Harris argued again, as far as he was concerned, the war would be won through bombing, which was wrong. It's no wars have actually ever really been won by bombing. But because of his position and the impossibility of getting rid of him, Churchill could not, found he couldn't even overrule him, which is extraordinary considering the power that one assumed Churchill to have at that particular stage. And Harris, and also then supported on the American side, again by the main sort of bombing commanders there, they were saying, frankly, yes, it's terrible what's happening, and we've read all the details, but we're liable to save more lives in the long run by shortening the war, and we think we'll shorten the war by bombing than cities, by bombing German cities, than we would by attacking the railway lines to the... And it's true. I mean, the mosquitoes, which were accurate, simply did not have the distance to get there. By the end of the war, curiously, they did actually bomb. They bombed Buna, they bombed Auschwitz, what was it, 3 or 4, was it? But that was purely because that had then gone onto the priority bombing list for the US Air Force. Which was a curious paradox. So, I mean, it's true, they could have done it if they'd actually bombed the camps themselves. But even Churchill was reluctant to the idea of actually bombing the camps, because that would have been literally the killing of sort of friendly civilians.
Do you have any...
No,
not.
I think we should actually open up for the audience. Well, while you're thinking, we have some more questions from here. Then we have Ellen Stensrud, Olav Njølstad. Ellen Stensrud, please introduce yourself before you have the mic, please.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting
Maybe you should
lecture.
stand up.
I'm Ellen Stensrud from the Norwegian Center for Holocaust and Minority Studies. I have a question about how you or we as academics, as students of genocides and mass atrocities should balance the more political, strategic analysis with the studies and descriptions of these horrible scenes that you have described yourselves, of massacres, of really heartbreaking individual stories. How do you consider the need to balance these two different approaches to history? Because, as we all noticed, you kind of move back and forth between these different levels of analysis, and I think they're both necessary, but sometimes it can be tempting to just stick to the big sort of political and strategic pictures and stay away from this very painful stories of the massacres and the individual suffering, etc.
Sorry, you meaning the balancing the functionalist, intentionalist, or the approach, or I mean, in a way, I mean, one can see that it's probably almost certainly a mixture of the two.
No, I think I was thinking rather in when you decide to write a book or to tell a story, the balance of including both the sort of the really horrific scenes that are really moving and heartbreaking with the more overall strategic analysis.
Well, that's the way I've always, I suppose, written since the early 1990s. In the 1980s, there was a tremendous fashion for oral history, of collections of letters and diaries and things like that. And I remember at the time thinking, that was insufficient. to put it mildly. Because up until then, history had been written very much more in a sort of top-down version, of a collective version of history. And as we got further away from the Second World War, we had less and less idea of what it meant to the people who were involved, the civilians. I do not describe myself ever as a military historian. I follow the great Professor Sir Michael Howard's dictum that actually we are historians of war, or we should be historians of war, i.e. we should be covering the refugees, the women and children, the ordinary soldiers who are caught up and had no control over their own fate. Because that is the only way really to communicate, I think, to a younger generation today what totalitarian warfare or what totalitarian life meant when we have lived for, well, at least up till now, a life of extraordinary privilege and peace in comparative terms since the Second World War. And so in a way, that was really the reason for sort of amalgamating history from above from history from below, which I think many other historians are certainly doing as well. And if one cannot understand that particular experience, you know, to read about the decisions of the main decision makers I think is insufficient in transmitting to a younger generation really what it was like at the time. On to another question, or
Yes, we are.
I presume we've got a fair number, have we?
Yeah, we have Olav Njølstad, Bernt Hagtrend, and a man behind there. It's so I can't see you. Any other hands? Well, you can just raise your hands while we're talking. Olav Njølstad, you can introduce yourself. You need a microphone, and please keep it into here.
Okay. I'm Olav Njølstad, professor of international history at the University of Oslo and director of the Norwegian Nobel Institute. Thank you for a brilliant talk on a very dark topic. My question is really a follow-up to the question from Tom Christiansen regarding the exact timing, to the extent we are able to pin down this point in time, of when the Allied governments fully understood what was going on. And you mentioned the joint statement of December 10th, 1942, which was a reaction, of course, to a report from the Polish government in exile.
That's right.
10 days before. And from that point of time, of course, there couldn't be any doubt. And a few weeks previous, in second part of November, I think it was, the U.S. government or State Department had concluded, had drawn the conclusion that the reports which had been coming in since the summer was indeed true. They had dismissed some of these reports to begin with.
Yes.
So sometimes between mid-August and second part of November,
yes,
they must have been convinced about these reports. And the reason why I am bringing this up is that some years ago we had a very interesting debate among Norwegian historians, rather heated, I would add, about to what extent Norwegian home resistance could have intervened and warned the Jewish population in Norway and helped them escape in time not to be deported, which happened in the second part of October, of course. And then the timing, of course, when did authorities in the Allied countries become a crucial factor? Some suggested that the Norwegian government in exile in London should have warned the home resistance previously so that they could have helped the Jews escape. So my question is there indications that the government in London and Washington knew for sure so that this warning could have been issued in time? And secondly, is there evidence that they shared this information with other allies, governments, until we come to this time in December when they issued this joint statement? And more specifically, the Norwegian government in exile. would they have reached this kind of information from the British government? Many questions. Thank you.
No, I think you're absolutely right in all you say there. The reason why it didn't sort of immediately become public in August was because the British government was trying to negotiate with allied governments, particularly with the United States, with France, and of course, obviously, with the allied governments in exile in London. So, I mean, information was being shared. It wasn't, I don't think, that any of them were necessarily reluctant, but they wanted to be able to come out with a common statement which could be agreed, and the trouble was, of course, negotiating with the Soviet Union, because that was they wanted to have a statement which would also be shared coming from Moscow as well at the same time. That was one of the main reasons why it was delayed as late as 10th of December. The problem, of course, with the Soviet Union, as I'm sure you know, I mean, obviously, as you know, is that Stalin did not want the Jews to be seen as a special category of suffering. As far as he was concerned, they were all citizens of the Soviet Union. And therefore they were not going to be seen. And the slogan which was used, and which Ilya Ehrenberg was the first to recognize, shall we say, the rising anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union during the latter part of the war, and the slogan was, "Do not divide the dead," i.e., do not give the Jews a special sort of, as I say, category of suffering. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Soviet Union was sort of rather reluctant over its acknowledgement and its involvement, in fact, in that. I do not know the details, I have to admit. It's quite a long time since I've worked on it. And I should really go back at some point and sort of go into it in more detail on exactly when the other allied governments were informed. But they were, because the whole point was to make it as international as possible. This was before any idea of the United Nations or whatever. I mean, the phrase of the United Nations was not really going to start coming into effect until really into 1943, after the Casablanca Conference, and the idea that it was a sort of a worldwide sort of organization against Nazism and of all of its crimes. So I wouldn't be able to go further than that. But but it's interesting that it does narrow down that particular field of what the Allies knew. And that statement of December 42 certainly had its effect in Nazi Germany, particularly amongst those who were, shall we say, patriotic Germans but not Nazis. They were the ones who realized that we are heading for defeat, and this was well before even the news of the encirclement at Stalingrad, which was actually going to become the psychological turning point of the war, had started to come out. So everything was really sort of concentrating in that sort of last particular period of 1942. Which was, as I was saying earlier on, which was why I thought that that Yad Vashem conference was so interesting, even though it threw up a lot of, shall we say, unexpected reactions. But that's another story in itself. What I found was actually that it was the young Israeli historians who were determined to believe that it was entirely anti-Semitic reactions amongst the British ruling class, which had, it was almost a conspiracy theory in that particular way, while the older generation, the Yehuda Bayes and so forth, completely rejected it. So one saw this extraordinary sort of intergenerational conflict, if you like, within Israeli historians at this particular stage. I hadn't foreseen it, but Gerhard Weinberg, who's a friend, who is also, he in fact did the final, keynote, and Gerhard had obviously realized the way things were going much more rapidly than I did, and he said to me after I'd finished my talk, he said, "Well, that was quite interesting." He said, "I didn't mean that he necessarily agreed, but he certainly, by the end, he was actually shouting back at some of the younger Israeli historians saying, I think you should show a little bit more gratitude towards the Allies because otherwise many more Jews would have died. So we were seeing an interesting historical debate going on in that particular phase.
Thank you. Any comments to that, Olav, or you wait? Then it's Vendepunktet, and then the gentleman behind there.
Yes, Vendepunktet, Professor of Political Science at the Oslo University College. So one of the most interesting and consequential aspects of your talk was your discussion about the intensification of atrocities. Faced with imminent defeat, it seems that the Nazis wanted to increase and strengthen deportation and killing of the Jews. Now, of course, this raises the whole question of the position of the Holocaust within the entire Nazi war machine. And we have been discussing the non-utilitarian aspect of the atrocities, that the Nazi would continue killing Jews despite the fact that it weakened the war effort. You did mention that some protests came from the Wehrmacht. May I ask you, did any of these protests from the Wehrmacht or other institutions in the Third Reich thinking that killing the Jews was, if not necessary, at least...
Sorry, could you...
yeah, it was a drain on resources. Can you think of instances where these protests came to fruition, that they were expected? And this, of course, touches the whole question of the nature of the Nazi regime and the place of the Holocaust within the Nazi war effort. So it didn't lead to any change of policy.
I think it had very little effect on policy. I mean, there are a number of paradoxes here. It was actually Colonel Count von Stauffenberg in the Abwehr who was the one who actually argued at the end of 1941 that the only way of winning in Russia was to raise a Ukrainian army of 1 million people to actually defeat the Red Army. But of course, Hitler was totally opposed to any idea of putting any Slavs or into Wehrmacht uniform. So, I mean, ideology was already overruling German military pragmatism right really from an earlier point. And that continued to be the case. But what was interesting was the way that you would then have Himmler raising a Galician division, which was basically, obviously, Ukrainian. But they had sort of, Cossack groups or whatever, Kosakkenzug, so that they were sort of using whatever they could to get round the ideological dictates of Hitler in that particular way. But as far as the actual protests were concerned, yes, there have been protests in Poland, as we know, Blaskowitz. But I mean, as far as the invasion of Barbarossa, there were very few. There were one or two who had the courage to speak out. And even actually within the Sixth Army. But I mean, they were a minuscule minority, and of course they were suppressed because, or they were basically warned, either you keep your mouth shut or you'll be arrested. Several were arrested, but as I say, it was an absolute tiny minority. But no senior commanders, until we get to the stage of the preparation of the so-called German resistance, Kluge-Hans and Generalfeldmarschall von Kluge and others were approached, but none of them showed any form of moral courage. I've always found it very, very striking the way that moral courage and physical courage seldom go hand in hand. The greatest moral cowards are quite often the bravest men. And that's actually why I've always been fascinated by Vasily Grossman, because he showed extraordinary physical courage as well as moral courage. And Churchill too. But I mean, I'm afraid on the whole, it is quite rare for those two things to go together. But as far as, real opposition, I mean, the only opposition was tended to be, the purely pragmatic thing of supplies and the railways and the Reichsbahn, and to what degree it was actually interfering the way with the resupply, not just of food and ammunition, but I mean even of weaponry and so forth. And that became particularly clear before the Battle of Kursk in 1943. It was by then the Reichsbahn was being basically given full priority to for the Holocaust rather than for the army, with disastrous results that we know about.
Thank you. And it's behind in the back there. I can't see you. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Mr. Beevor. My name is Gaute Skjervø. I'm the Vice President of the Norwegian Labour Youth, and I'm also a member of the Governmental Commission on Extremism, trying to figure out how to give young people different kind of methods to fight anti-Semitism and the rise of extremism in Norway today. I would like to ask you a question regarding the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe today. We could see all over the Western Europe and also in the US how anti-Semitism and also the rise of the global fascism is heading back, and at the same time the last survivors of the Holocaust are leaving us. The last Norwegian survivor of the Holocaust in Auschwitz, Samuel Steinmann, died 7 years ago, and we have lost the ones who can tell us the stories about the atrocities from first hand. So my question to you is, what do you believe is the most important way that we can teach our young generations about the atrocities of the Nazi Germany, and also how the anti-Semitic policies of the Nazi Germany had effects on the entire Jewish population around the world? Thank you.
I think the most important lesson of all is going back to this idea that one should not teach the Holocaust separately from history. And I think taking it out of history, as tended to be the fashion a number of years ago, was disastrous. It is vital that we see, and this is what I'm trying to do, and not just because by pure coincidence my book on the Russian Civil War has come out at the time of with the Ukraine war. But what I think is absolutely vital is one understands the chain of events of the 20th century to understand the dangers in the 21st century. I think that historians are quite right when they argue that the First World War was the original catastrophe. But what became very, very striking, certainly to me, on researching and working on the whole subject of the Russian Revolution and Civil War, was the way that the sheer horror, the destruction, the cruelty, had made the Russian Civil War actually the most influential war of the 20th century, because it created not just the left versus right, the red versus white, the communist versus fascist or Nazi or whatever. The process of polarization basically dominated the whole of the 20th century, right up to the end of what one could describe as Cold War I in 1989. Now we're into Cold War II. Now, Cold War II is obviously different in a way because it's not so obviously left and right. Shall we say, the angle or the axis of conflict has shifted slightly towards authoritarianism versus democracy. And what we have seen, and maybe this is a question of shifting of generations, you're quite right to be alarmed about the rise of anti-Semitism, of authoritarianism, of even pro-Nazism, even in democratic countries, is this switch away from as I say, the old left versus right polarization that has dominated our lives for so long. I mean, for really almost 100 years. this, I think, has actually created its own counter-revolution is the wrong phrase, but its own counter-reaction. And so those who are exasperated, who are irritated by what they see as smug democracy, wokeism, all of the phrases that have been used recently to attack, if you like, the traditional liberal order. All of these are an encouragement, if you like, to those who are frustrated, angered, embittered. Many of them have probably never met a Jew in their life, but they will still sort of, sign up to anti-Semitism purely because of the reaction that causes. I think, it's like wanting, to rebel against your parental generation to a certain degree. But there is also, as I say, a deep and burning anger, and it varies from country to country. I mean, in some countries, it is really getting quite alarming of the degree. We're even seeing in Germany, where the extreme left and the extreme right start to link up. With Die Linke and Alternative für Deutschland. This is truly alarming, but that shows you that it is again part of this sort of axis of conflict, which actually is very much linked to civil wars, whether the Russian Civil War, the Spanish Civil War. You start to see actually that there are three axes of conflict on the whole. There is centralism versus regionalism. There is authoritarianism versus libertarianism. And of course, there's either left versus right or authority versus democracy. And I think that we have, not only have we seen this in the past, but we're starting to see it again. And it is a form of national disintegration which is taking place, but fired up often by nationalism itself. So there are a number of extraordinary paradoxes here, which I think are fascinating and horrifying at the same time. But where it's going to take us is very, very hard. And the only other thing I would just particularly add, now that we are into what one would describe as Cold War II, is I took part recently in there was a conference on the future of geopolitics in Scotland with Jeremy Hunt, now the British Chancellor, having just been Foreign Minister. I don't know what else he's been, but then in Britain we're used to this revolving door of politics at the moment, I'm afraid. I hope it's now going to slow down. And George Robertson, former Secretary General of NATO. And we all agreed that one of the real problems is what is the future of traditional diplomacy, of negotiation, when you are dealing with people who are so convinced of the rightness of their own cause that they are not prepared to stick to anything they promise or agree or anything like that. I mean, the irony is that in Cold War I, communist leaders, whether China or Russia or whatever, would stick to assurances or agreements that they'd made. This is no longer the case. So is the future of traditional diplomacy dead? How will, therefore, one ever be able to end conflicts like the war in Ukraine or whatever on a stable basis? And how will you be able to secure peace and should we say, international relations in the future? And actually, this is one of the things which frightens me more than almost anything else. We have got beyond that particular stage. I think we are definitely into a new era, not just of a new era of Cold War, but a new era of international relations itself. And that I do find very frightening.
Thank you. That was quite an answer. Good luck to the Extremism Commission. Then we have two more, Rolf Kirchner here and the gentleman in blue or black. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Beevor. My name is Rolf Kirchner. I am an ex-president of the Oslo Jewish society, and also a past founder member and board member of the Holocaust Center. I was quite surprised to hear that Hitler and his Nazi crowd tried for a long time just to, in brackets, to expel the Jewish population without harming them, just taking their properties and expelling them. Doesn't that clash with the results of the Evian conference?
Sorry, clash with what?
With the results of the Evian conference the year before, when nobody wanted the Jews. Where would he send them when no country wanted to accept them? And since you mentioned the anger of the young Jewish or Israeli historians, maybe the results of the same conference and the results, the fate of the Jews during the war, may be one of the reasons why the young Israeli historians think that pure anti-Semitism was behind the whole non-solution.
Well, the thing about that particular conference, and also the sort of the general reaction afterwards, was very much the one. I mean, the British problem, of course, was the poisoned chalice of the Palestine Mandate. How on earth are we going to sort this particular one out? And while as I say, the older generation of Israeli historians, I think, was sort of looking at it very much more with the perspective of the period, the younger historians were looking at it very much more, if you like, which I think is a mistake, with the viewpoint that you can impose the ideas of today on a previous period. And that, I think is one of the big mistakes and one of the big problems that historians are facing at the moment. But when it came to, you say you were surprised that the Nazis didn't want to harm them. Well, I would have said that actually dumping people on Madagascar without any means of support would certainly have been harming them. I mean, basically the whole idea was just simply to starve them to death. They knew perfectly well that Madagascar was not capable of dealing with a population of however many hundreds of thousands of Jews being dumped on it. It would have been disastrous for the local population as well as, of course, for all of the Jews dumped there. So I wouldn't describe that as failing to harm them. I'd have thought it would have been as ghastly as the hunger plan that the Soviets wanted for the western part of the Soviet Union. So I don't know. I don't think I can sort of say very much more than that. I mean, I know perfectly well that there were tremendous problems. I mean, Bevin, the British foreign minister, who was sort of, I think, infuriated partly because of some of the hanging of the two British sergeants or whatever. There were definitely reactions in Britain where the whole question of anti-Zionist reactions were powerful at that particular stage, partly because of the Örgensvejlume, the Haganah, and so forth, which all came out of the problems of the mandate. And, whether it's Exodus and all the rest of it. Funny enough, my wife's grandfather, because he was the ambassador in Paris, was very much caught up in it, Duff Cooper, because the French were saying, right, well, we're not going to in any way stop any of the emigration. And yet at the same time, the British government was trying to maintain, despite complaints from the United States, they were saying you've got to open the borders entirely or whatever. But at the same time, they knew then that there would be a war in Palestine straight away. So it wasn't sort of quite as straightforward. I'm not trying to deny that there was still an intrinsic element of British anti-Semitism, which probably played a role. On the whole, British anti-Semitism tended to be, funny enough, much more one of snobbery, to be perfectly honest. It was one of much more of bad jokes. It was different to French anti-Semitism in that particular way. I mean, I know one should be very careful about generalizing in these ways and all the rest of it. But I'm never going to forget that introduction by, oh God, sorry, I'm having a senior moment at the moment. The destruction of the European Jews.
Hilberg, Raoul.
Who, in one of his introductions, said, if in 1900 you had predicted that a civilized country in Europe would one day be involved in the industrial slaughter of Jews, you'd have said those French, they're capable of anything. I'm afraid that there was an element during that particular period of which sort of still lingered on. But as I say, I think that the sort of the British form of anti-Semitism, on the whole, tended to be much less virulent, as one could see. It was unthinkable in European aristocracies for grand families to marry Jews. I mean, but when Rosebery, married Hannah Rothschild, and you had the other sort of intermarriages at that particular stage in the mid-19th century, I don't think you would have got that in other countries, but there was still a very, very strong, there was a much greater intermingling. I mean, Disraeli as prime minister would have been unthinkable in any other country. But there was, as I say, a sort of a lingering snobbery or anti-Semitism in that particular way. Which was much less virulent than in other countries. When one thinks of sort of, Austria and Russia and so forth. I mean, in Russia, of course, you had, the Tsar and the Black Hundreds and so forth, well before the end of the century. So, to say that sort of one country was worse than another is always rather hard. But it was certainly, I mean, in Russia, one has to remember, the anti-Semitism after the war with the pogroms in Kiev and other places like that. And this was, returning Red Army soldiers literally taking the opportunity. Now, to many points of view, many of them had no idea of Nazi anti-Semitism because, again, going back to Stalin's idea, do not divide the dead, and no question of allowing Soviet citizens to know that the Jews had suffered. Which is also one of the reasons why, for example, many of them had no idea at what danger they were in the summer of 1941. I mean, with Grossman, Berdichev, and so forth.
Thank you. There are two more. If you have a comment, Rolf, you have to sign up again because we need a microphone. But first, this gentleman on the second row, and then there's a gentleman in the middle back. But you have to raise your hand again so we can see you. Jenny, do you see him? Yeah. Please introduce yourself. Yep.
My name is Einar Rivarden. I'm just an avid reader. I want to
have it into.
My name is Einar Rivarden. I'm an avid reader. Yeah. I was wondering if you could possibly summarize something about the perpetrators after the war. There seemed to be a fairly intense hunt for them for some years, and then Germany, as far as I know, quickly refused to hand them over to the Allies. And on the whole, but did most of them get away with what they did? Can you comment?
Well, things went through different phases. The attempts to sort of round up the perpetrators was carried out either very quickly or it was delayed. Now, one has to remember, to what degree did the Cold War play a part? Well, obviously, there was a very big element in that particular case, and that was why the priority, certainly for, shall we say, particularly British and Americans, concerned by the Soviet threat, was in many cases either to recruit Nazis who could be useful on an intelligence level or particularly on a scientific level. So that's where you get the Browns, the Werner von Brauns and others who were then became very, very useful. But in Germany itself, yes, a lot of people did, because the Germans basically refused to acknowledge, this is the great danger of generalization, but I mean, I was attacked over about 3 pages in Spiegel by great German biographer of Hitler and yes, saying that purely because I'd actually quoted, it wasn't because of something I'd written actually, but I'd quoted a report, an intelligence report by which was summarizing all of the interrogations of senior Germans and particularly military commanders and so forth. This was for SHAEF, for the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Europe, or SHAEF rather at that particular stage. I'd basically shown how they'd said, but you know, it was a great mistake. It was a great mistake to persecute the Jews. Just think what wonderful weapons they could have made for us. I mean, it was unbelievable, the denial, the state of denial amongst senior German officials and others. Now, to what degree some of them were out-and-out perpetrators who were just trying to cover up themselves, or others were, shall we say, covering up for their class, their background, or just their country in that particular way. But there was a deliberate attempt, there was no doubt about it, in that early period, of not to take the whole thing too seriously. And we don't know, anyway, apart from anything else, you know, surely we want to be allies together against the Soviet Union. And this is something which, of course, went back even into the war itself, where German officers, when captured, would say, you know, why are we fighting each other? We should be fighting, you know, the Soviet Union together. So that goes on. But I mean, what's interesting is that it took until January 1979 before suddenly there was a real awakening in Germany about what had really happened. And it was all caused by that very superficial Hollywood miniseries, Holocaust, with Meryl Streep. And that actually triggered the real debate between the generations, between the younger and the older ones, on what had really happened, what did you know about it at the time? So it did, I mean, you know, there were other moments, like, for example, you know, when the Eichmann trial, or there had been other moments when there had been debates. But it went backwards and forwards. You got that strange, very strange book by Daniel Goldhagen of Hitler's Willing Executioners, where, you know, hundreds of thousands of Germans were sort of beating their breasts, blaming themselves almost as a country, which actually was ridiculous in a way, because Goldhagen's argument, to a large degree, was that Germans were inherently anti-Semitic. But actually, under Frederick the Great, Prussia was the least anti-Semitic country in Europe. So, you know, where did it come from? Why did it suddenly develop in the way that it did in the second half of the 19th century? And all of these things, but then a couple of years later, in a counter-reaction to that, you had in Krebsgang, you had the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff, and the novel there, and Der Brand, the book about accusing Churchill of war crimes. So you did have sort of swings and roundabouts in Germany in terms of notions of guilt. But now I think that on the whole it's been far more the sort of the historians' debate or civil war has sort of calmed down completely now, I think, on the whole, and it's now on the whole much more rational.
Thank you. Then we have a gentleman here behind. Yes, please.
I think that this is the last one. I'm really honest.
Yeah, okay, then we're closing. Then it's only one short one,
Right,
and then we're
just one
closing.
more
Is that okay?
Yeah,
Two more, and then we're closing. Please.
Hello. My question concerns Madagascar. How much time did the Nazis actually spend on working out a plan to send the Jews to Madagascar? Was it just some Nazi vagary, or whether it actually spent hundreds of man-hours planning this, or, you know?
I mean, you're quite right to raise the question. I mean, where I don't think anybody really knows, but I mean, it was pretty superficial. You know, the idea was it was a country off Africa, it was a large island, there was lots of space, and therefore you should be able to fit lots of Jews onto it. I mean, you know, nobody had done any research on where they were going to land them. I mean, you know, Madagascar is not exactly, it's only got one decent, or in those days, they only had one decent port. And even then, I mean, there was no real, shall we say, contingency planning or anything like that, where they were going to get the shipping from. You know, even if in the most appalling conditions, they'd sort of crammed tens of thousands onto ships and sort of put them out there. But I mean, you know, the whole idea that it's off Africa, the Royal Navy was still at that stage the largest navy in the world. Whatever happened to the French fleet after the defeat of France. I mean, so actually it was a ludicrous idea. But there was sort of, I suppose, such incredible belief in German success and victory that they were prepared to sort of consider anything. But once again, also, it showed the complete lack of joined-up thinking, especially with the Kriegsmarine, who weren't, I don't think, even brought in properly into into the discussions. Now, Hitler liked it, liked the idea of sort of, you know, separating out and not letting. He didn't like people discussing with each other. Everything had to go really through him or through the top so that he could control things better. And I think that this was another good example whereby you did not see proper discussions going on at a lower level. So yes, it was sort of much more, fantasy is perhaps the wrong word, but it's not very far off. Because, I mean, okay, it was in a way an obvious island, especially after the defeat of France, having come under French, I mean, having been under Vichy control. But I really don't see how anything could have ever emerged from that at all.
Thank you. And then a short one, please. Then.
This is not a question. I think that you misunderstood me. I was referring to the conference in Evian in France in 1938, stating that no country wanted to accept any Jewish refugees. I was not pointing to British anti-Semitism, to Palestine, nor to Madagascar. I was just pointing to the conference in Evian. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Well, my mistake for mistaking that. Yes, absolutely. I have to admit, I have not actually studied the Evian conference in any great detail, so I will confess to that straight away.
Well, it's been actually quite discussed in Norway recently, actually.
Oh, right.
But anyway, I think, actually, Tom, we should close in.
Yes,
this
yes.
has been a fabulous
And just
evening.
let me, to conclude, thank you so much for your talk and for sharing your thoughts on an array of topics. It has been very interesting. So thank you again.
Tom.
And you will find Sir Antony Beevor outside signing books on something quite different, the Russian Revolution and Civil War. And here at the House of Literature, we will meet again in November 10th on the war up north. Thank you so much.